Welcome to a Falcon Media podcast special, reporting live from the dorm room. This is Falcon Media Channel Director Brianna Scebbi, and today I'll be speaking with 4 college journalists from across the country to discuss how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the multimedia storytelling they have been doing in their own newsrooms. From Boston University's Daily Free Press, we'll hear from Editor-in-Chief Colby Edmonds.
I hate to be like, it's unprecedented, but it is unprecedented.
A little farther south on the East Coast, audience engagement editor Pravina Somasundaram of the Daily Tar Heel at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill will share her experience.
At the end of the day, you've still only slept a handful of hours and had 4 cups of coffee.
All the way on the West Coast is CalPoly Mustang News lead data investigations reporter Omar Rashad, who is also the former editor-in-chief of the Union newspaper at El Camino Community College in Torrance, California.
So yeah, I was literally right there when we had to push everything online. We had to figure out what we're doing.
And back home with us in Bowling Green, Ohio, is the BG News editor-in-chief, Shaylee Hoff.
And so we just thought, okay, well, this is news. It's time to go and report.
The events of March 2020 that led to college campuses across the country closing and moving classes online hit college newsrooms from all sides.
But because we weren't in person anymore, we weren't able to print newspapers. We Zoom all of our meetings. We don't ever really go into the office unless we're printing. And even then, it's only 3 people and we're social distance wearing masks.
When everybody's remote, that makes communication a lot more dependent on Slack.
We didn't really have a break even after we went home and extended spring break and everything because there was information, there were decisions being made and people needed to know about them.
National outlets covered the national response to college's COVID protocols, while student journalists were on the ground gathering local grievances from community members in their college towns and their fellow students. Soon, though, these young reporters began to make headlines themselves. The Washington Post followed the transition from physical newspapers and studio newscasts to emailed newsletters and homecasts as student journalists, many of whom were also dealing with the challenges of online classes and living with immunocompromised family members, took things, quote, 1 week at a time, end quote. BU Daily Free Press editor-in-chief Colby Edmonds says a year later her team is finally settling in, but not without continuing challenges.
I think it's interesting because when it was announced that BU wasn't returning, we had already been on spring break, so everyone was kind of scattered. So different time zones. But I think this semester everyone is either in Boston or on the East Coast, so no one has to deal with incredibly different time zones. I don't know, editing and running a newspaper is so much about communication, and it's so hard to just be in your room and have these pretty, it could be such a simple question, but for some reason it's so hard to communicate that through text message. So that's been a big thing. And then also something is whenever you're in, it's so easy to fall asleep. And that has happened the past 2 semesters, where people will just accidentally fall asleep before everything's done. Well, it's 3 a.m. We're probably all in a dark room editing. It's going to happen. So that's a unique challenge, I think, that we've kind of to be okay, guys, we're so exhausted, but we've got to stay up.
While part of working from home for some student journalists entails not dozing off during print nights, others were carrying the mantle of being a source of information in a news desert. The New York Times coverage of the only daily newspaper in Ann Arbor, Michigan, describes the duty student reporters feel for the public, and how in some places, if students aren't writing the story, then no one is. Omar Rashad, the former editor-in-chief of the Union at El Camino Community College, led efforts to write those otherwise unwritten stories.
We really were filling in that gap in hyper-local coverage that, cities like Torrance, Inglewood, Hawthorne, Gardena, Lawndale were not getting. And, even before the pandemic, that's what the Union's role was in our community, to report about our college community. There was a bit of a focus on only sticking to our college community. But when the pandemic happened, we decided to open that up and quite literally start reporting about our neighboring cities in a way that we had previously not done before. And that meant, doing a COVID dashboard in terms of cases in local cities.
But for all of the challenges COVID-19 brought to college newsrooms, the positive impact of audiences being served by passionate journalists accompanies a number of other silver linings.
We also started our weekly podcast, Heel Talk, in March, and I produced the pilot episode, and I remember that was all about timeline for how things happened with COVID and Chapel Hill and how that led to where we were in quarantine and things like that. And so I remember like that was our first time like taking on a podcast project like that, and because we'd never done like something that was planned to be a consistent university news-based podcast.
Shifting from print to focusing on this newsletter meant that we were thinking about online in a more focused way. This might be a hot take, but I really do feel like journalism has been moving online. And this might be a little controversial to say, but I feel like social media is today's newspaper. The newspaper of the 90s is, today's social media. Being able to better connect with online audiences in a meaningful way, in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases means that, you are getting to people in a more direct way.
Not only was service to these newsrooms' audiences improved as they adapted to the pandemic, but also the culture within their newsrooms surrounding key issues like burnout and mental health.
I mean, I think everyone has just been feeling super isolated, and it's been difficult for everyone's mental health. And I think that we've started having more conversations about that and just kind of recognizing the mental toll that it is to be an editor for a student newspaper. Like, I've never felt this burnt out ever. And I think that, being an editor while simultaneously being in a pandemic is a lot. And I think that because there's such extreme situations, we've kind of been forced to be like, okay, wait, we need to start having more of these conversations.
I also think we should take more time for ourselves, not just as journalists, but as people, because yeah, it's a full-time job, but at what point, do we start caring about ourselves? At what point does our mental health interfere with our work?
We've learned a lot about burnout this year as a newsroom because we're all so exhausted. And I feel like I talk about it with my newsroom colleagues a lot. Like, we're tired. Like, sometimes we'll just walk into the office and look at each other and we're like, yeah, it's one of those days. And it feels like every day is kind of like that. And every day has been like that throughout COVID-19. But our editor-in-chief this year, she implemented a lot of things to help with that. So we had newsroom days off that every editor could take. And I think that was really helpful because we didn't have that before. A few desks got another assistant added, which helped lessen like everyone on that desk's workload, which was helpful. And so doing things like that we haven't really done before, but were kind of necessary to adapt our newsroom workflow during the pandemic. I think I'd like to keep around too. So making sure that like when I'm seeing burnout from my staff, implementing things or like asking them if they need an extra day off, just so that even though we produce a lot of work and a lot of good work and a lot of needed work, making sure that like everyone in the newsroom also understands that their mental health and well-being is also something that's needed and important.
Whether on the West Coast, in the heart of the Midwest, or on the East Coast, student journalists have been using adaptive tools like social media, e-newsletters, and podcasts to be able to reach their audiences where they're at when print newspapers were no longer accessible to them as student journalists during the COVID-19 pandemic. This has been Reporting Live from the Dorm Room. I'm Brianna Scebbi, and thank you for listening.